human rights atrocities.
Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time. I am Paul Ndiho. Joining me on set is Shaka Sali himself, aka the Kavali Kid. Hello Shaka, how are you?
Hello Paul.
How are you today?
Usually terrific. You look terrific, of course, with a sort of pin stripes.
Well, you know, like I said before, I'm always looking up to you. You are the stylist in this particular case, right?
But I told you that all you need, brother, you need to essentially step up and climb on my shoulders. And once you are actually on top of my shoulders, you know what happens. You have the ability, the capability of seeing much further than I.
Well, a warm welcome to you all, our Facebook followers are watching us live. Shaka Extra Time is a show that comes to you every Tuesday. Today we'll be talking about a wide range of issues, but I think we'll start in Southern Africa, where people are still reeling from Cyclone Idai. As we speak, the flood waters are beginning to recede, and communities are beginning to bury their loved ones, perhaps with dignity and respect that they deserve. Your thoughts, Shaka?
I think that we should really give credit to the international community in the sense that it seems to pretty much really has, stepped up. They're providing some of the fundamentals in order to sustain life, but they still need to do more.
Shaka, the level of destruction on the ground was unprecedented. A lot of people still haven't even recovered. They don't even know if their loved ones survived or died. And in terms of response, there are places where the response has been slow. Your reaction?
I think part of it, of course, is that, there are some countries, frankly, which don't seem to have any relationship with the early warning system. But of course, as we saw last week when we had this edition on these issues, we were blessed, of course, with the Mozambican permanent representative to the United Nations. And he pretty much said that in as far as the Mozambican authorities are concerned, they had really done everything within their power in terms of exploiting the early warning system so as to alert their people and what have you. And of course, it wasn't perfect.
You mentioned the Mozambican permanent representative to New York. I watched the show and I thought he was remarkably articulate in terms of how he presented the case about his country.
Remarkably articulate, I would agree with you, and perhaps even add, remarkably candid.
Interesting, yeah.
We need those types of people really to represent our countries.
What lessons can the other African countries that are prone to this kind of weather changing patterns learn from the experience of Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe?
First of all, I think there is the issue of, I call it education or sensitization. I think governments should really figure out a way of interacting with the population, of making sure that they alert them about the fundamental things that need to be done, or the things that should be expected to be done just in case those types of situations, come up. Because we've seen situations where, for example, like in Zimbabwe, there were people, frankly, who were complaining that the government was not able, for example, to alert them, to warn them in advance. And in some cases, even when in fact they were able to do that, they could not direct them specifically where they could go in situations which were secured. So those things have to be taken care of. And also you have to mobilize, for example, the medical corps, the nurses, the doctors, and what have you, because we see that sometimes you're dealing with airborne diseases, you're dealing with the spread of malaria, you're dealing with cholera, and in some cases you're also dealing with TB, tuberculosis, as you say.
Earlier we were talking about how in some cases the response has been very slow. From your assessment, what do you think could have been done better?
Well, I think that government officials really, or authorities, need to be a little bit more sensitive. By sensitivity, I mean to be socially, to be politically, to be culturally sensitive, to be in a situation where they are ready to provide services. We need to have a situation sincerely where service delivery is not simply something that is talked about, but in fact, we need to be able to see government authorities in these countries. We need to see them not simply talking the talk, but in fact, walking the talk so that their people can actually walk the walk.
Let's, cross over to politics now. Let's talk a little bit about politics in Algeria. Things seem to be brewing in terms of very soon we could have change of guard in Algeria. The ailing leader is being forced out by young people. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, we could have change indeed, but is there a guarantee that we could in fact have change? Or is it more of the same?
That remains to be seen.
Because let's face it, when you're talking about a man like Bouteflika, you're not really talking about an individual. You're talking about someone who happens to be a symbol that is a representative and a reflection of the movement or the party that he belongs to. The party, by the way, that launched the liberation struggle against the French colonialists back in 1954. These guys had to fight not only a war, they fought for 8 years in order for them to finally get the chance of being politically independent. And when you talk about Algeria, by the way, Paul, Algeria was not your ordinary colony. Algeria was a settler colony. In other words, it was in fact part of France. Part of France in the sense that the highlands and what have you had been occupied by the French citizens. The vast majority of Algerians were basically very peripheral. They didn't really mean anything and what have you. And so Algeria was a settler colony just like Kenya was in East Africa, or Zimbabwe was when it was Rhodesia and what have you in Southern Africa, and to a certain degree South Africa. We're talking about apartheid South Africa. These were countries which were never supposed to be politically independent under the stewardship of the indigenous Africans. But unfortunately, Algeria has gone through a lot. The problem with Algeria is that you have the National Liberation Front, which is the movement that in fact fought against France and won independence in 1962. It has been in power since then, beginning with Ahmed Ben Bella, being the first president.
Right.
And then you had Boumediene, and then of course he dies in office, and you have Benjedid, Chadli Benjedid. So you have then later, you have a man that I admired so much when he was foreign minister in the 60s and part of the 70s, Bouteflika.
You still admire the same guy?
Well, the thing is, there are certain aspects about him that I said, again, admired. We are talking about the context of history here. We're talking about when the man, in fact, had the future ahead of him. We are now talking about a man whose future, if it is there at all, is behind him. But I think what we have to look at, really, we have to look, for example, at the group that he represents. We are talking about, again, the National Liberation Front. This is a group that won political independence in Algeria in 1962. and it has actually been in power since then. And so what does it tell us? It tells us that these people who decide to mobilize and organize around the AK-47 and say that they are liberators, freedom fighters, they can call them all sorts of names, themselves all sorts of names. Once they in fact get power, they seize power, they actually somehow look at it as if in fact it belongs to them. They develop a sense of ownership. They develop a sense not only of ownership, but in fact a sense of entitlement.
Revolutionaries don't go. They hang around forever.
That is true. In fact, we have had some leaders saying that revolutionaries, in fact, do not go for leave.
They don't have constitutional mandates.
They do not do that because they have ownership. They own.
That brings me to a very interesting question here. Why is it that we've seen these revolutionaries forced out in North Africa? We saw it happen in Libya, in Egypt, in Tunisia. And these are young people who have taken the mantle to force these guys out. How come we don't see we don't see another version of the Arab Spring down maybe in East Africa, in Central Africa? Because we've had a lot of young people rise up, but their efforts they're beaten up and arrested, and they forget the cause, and yet in Northern Africa it seems to yield result.
Be very careful, to be honest with you, Paul, because what you wish for could actually happen.
How?
Because let's face it, you have the changing demographics. You have the changing demographics in tandem with social media. The changing demographics talk about young people forming a majority in the population, almost in every country. And this majority of young people are not invested in the status quo. They're not invested in the economy. For them, the economy is stupid. They need to have an opportunity to benefit from the economy. And therefore, the only thing really that can be in their favor at that point is change. And so when you think about the fact that they have the advantage of social media, which exposes them to a lot of issues that are taking place and are happening and what have you, and they also learn from other human experiences where changes actually are taking place, you can be assured that one day they will wake up, they will mobilize, organize, and speak with one voice.
Let me push back a little bit on that. You talk about social media. Not every young person across the continent has access to social media. Or in some places, some of these leaders who have been in power for a long time, they've figured out a way of, cutting off that social media or cutting off the internet. So how are these young people going to rally or organize themselves to maybe to speak in one voice?
But first of all, you talk about the authorities have figured it a way out. I mean, how do they figure a way out? For example, when somebody is hungry, there is saying that it is actually necessity, which is the mother of invention, correct? If you are hungry, what are the authorities going to do for you? Are they going to feed you?
Absolutely not.
Of course not. And therefore, the young people, on the basis of the fact that they are also, among other things, patriotic to their stomachs, because this is nature. Nature requires that as a human being, in order to sustain yourself, you have to eat. And therefore, you have to look for food in whatever way is possible. They are going to have to mobilize. They are going to be in a position where they organize and can actually make their numbers begin to speak with one voice. And let's face it, the future is ahead of them, not behind them. And they are going to make it, just in the same way that you have seen and you are actually pointing to some situations that have been successful in favor of the young people taking up their rightful places.
Let's go to some comments. People are interested in this topic. Let's start in Malawi. Let's go Chichewa Chisomo. Is democracy a prerequisite for development?
You know, it is very interesting that he's asking that question. I will have to say, unfortunately, if he felt that it wasn't, it actually is the answer. It may not necessarily be quote-unquote democracy, but it has to be something that is a reflection of what sometimes are referred to as a situation which reflects social, economic, political justice. Another name could be democracy. Democracy is about, in fact, presiding over an equal society, so to speak. We're talking about society that is an egalitarianism. And when we talk about traditional African politics, we're talking about extended relationships. We're talking about being your neighbor's keeper, your brothers, your sisters' keeper, holding your brothers and your sisters back. This is one thing that Africans, traditional African culture, requires them to do. The only problem is that Africans so far have not been able to manage the state, the government, in a manner that reflects their very beautiful African traditional culture.
Let's stay in Malawi. Let's go to Chrissy Ndalama. How do you look at the politics in Malawi? And can you speak about the issue of age limit in politics across the continent?
First of all, I wouldn't really want to necessarily, be an authority on Malawi because I do not live in Malawi. I was last in Malawi in August last year, and I'm sure a lot of things have changed since then. But I keep monitoring what is happening from, of course, right here, which is thousands and thousands of miles away. So, in fact, I should be in a position where I should benefit from people like the person who is asking me that question, briefing me as to how the politics of Malawi are panning out. What I can say is that I don't think really there is an issue with age limit. What I think that people or societies should take care of in their constitutions, if they still have constitutions, they should make sure that they have term limits. Once you have term limits, you don't have to worry about age limits. Because you see, when you think about abilities and capabilities, there are certain situations where you look at wine, for example. The older the wine is, the much better it is.
I will disagree with that, but when it comes to politicians...
Do you disagree with the fact that the wine, the older it is better?
So no. I like that argument, but when it comes to politicians...
There are certain individuals also, by the same token, when they get older, they get wiser. Which is not to say that everything is that way.
Some of them start getting dementia at that point. They no longer...
This is not a generalization.
Yeah.
I said there are some individuals, and it is true. There's no question about it. I mean, you can look at a man like Lee Kuan Yew, for example. By the time, he leaves power, he was not a young man. But he made a huge difference in terms of the island, the city-state of Singapore. It's a fact that has legs to actually make it work. But there are also situations where, by the way, there are a lot of young people who really do not amount to much in terms of leadership. They don't really have the capability of leading their countries. So I don't think we should really spend a lot of time on age limits. It is not age limit that is important. It is term limits that are very important. Once you have term limits, you don't have to worry about the age limit because you take care of that.
But Shaka, one could argue that if you have term limits, one could easily say, okay, let's say if it's the ruling party that has always won, they have the majority, whatever, and as long as they have the majority, they can still be in power.
No, no, no. I am saying that you should have term limits in your constitution and make sure that you protect that, not this business of somebody coming and shifting goalposts. I mean, there are situations where people really, they have political parties and what have you, but actually those political parties do not have the power. Their power belongs to an individual who simply uses a political party as a front. We have known situations where people are in positions of leadership, but in fact all they have is a rank and a position with no authority.
Let's go to Festus Luyoga. Why are most politicians in Africa have at least become hypocrites or pretend to be doing something for their communities, while they are not when they're actually doing stuff for their own personal families and stuff like that?
I think part of the problem is that we actually make them have the opportunity to be able to do that. We allow them to tell us lies. We allow them as people to lie us. We allow them to pretend to be, or at least to give the sense or impression that in fact they are what they are not. It is up to the people themselves at the end of the day. I think the people, if, for example, they are socially and politically conscious, they will not allow that kind of leader to dominate them. Because at the end of the day, it is the numbers game. Politics is about the numbers game. But you also have to know that one of the definitions of politics is that it is the art of all possibilities. In other words, there is a window of an opportunity for crooks. There is a window of an opportunity for people who are liars, people who are con men, and what have you, to take advantage of those windows of opportunities and dominate and exploit their populations. We need to guard against that. And we can only do that, for example, if we do our homework, we do our research, so that we can organize, we can mobilize and organize and speak with one voice. The young people, for example, if you know that you have no stake in the status quo, then you have to be able to mobilize yourselves, organize yourselves around the issues that are going to be able to benefit you as a people, not simply to listen to these lies and go and sleep on empty stomachs. Because let's face it,
go to another
you
comment
are seeing now in Algeria, there are going to be changes, and there are going to be changes precisely because the young people, the professional bodies and what have you, they have come together and actually voted with their feet. It happened again in Egypt at one time, in Tahrir Square. You remember that? Mm-hmm. Even though, of course, later the soldiers hijacked it. It happened in Tunisia. It's still happening there.
Ben Ali.
Yeah. So it means that it can also happen elsewhere. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, one has to know that society, just like people, is not static. It is dynamic.
Okay, perfect segue. Real quickly, let's go to Amina. Democracy is an equitable way of life. Do you agree with that kind of statement?
It is supposed to be an equitable way of life. It is supposed to reflect and represent social, economic, political justice for all. And if it does not, then it is not a democracy.
But in practice, has anything like that happened?
Of course it has happened.
Where?
I mean, what are you talking about? I mean, look at the Scandinavian countries, for example. Look at the Scandinavian countries. Every human being who is born has the guarantees of life. You have a right to eat, to have food. You have a right to live in a decent house. You have a right to have unfettered access to education. You have a right, if you are sick, to have unfettered access to medical care. That is democracy.
How do you respond to Oginga Geoffrey, who says democracy is a dictatorship of people against the majority power, rather?
I don't know what you're talking about.
No, he says it's a dictatorship of the people, or the majority who are in power, against the other ordinary people.
Well, you could say that democracy is a dictatorship of an organized majority of sorts. But at the end of the day, democracy also has fundamental features, fundamental tenets, for example, that reflect and give you the power, which is the power, for example, to actually have a right to own an opinion, and an opinion that may not necessarily be the same as the party in power, or the state, or the ruling party, or that way. That is why you have elections sometimes in democratic societies, and that is why sometimes you have one party actually winning an election, and sometimes a party that is in power actually losing an election. Because you have to have freedom of expression, you have to have freedom of media, freedom of press, where, you know, a diversity of opinions are being expressed in a sort of marketplace where ordinary people can actually make decisions based on the kind of information that is available to them.
Shaka, what are you talking about at tomorrow's Straight Talk Africa?
Tomorrow we are going to look, unfortunately, at the genocide that occurred in the Republic of Rwanda in 1994, and we are going to be looking at whether there are any significant lessons that have been learned out of that tragedy, so that that sort of tragedy should not recur or should not happen again anywhere else. That in fact, instead of perhaps people changing governments with force, with weapons, killing each other and what have you, that they should figure out a better way of negotiating, of sitting down, comparing notes, compromising here and there, and figuring out how best to live together. We should also find out whether in fact there is a way or a means of closure to those families who lost their loved ones.
How would you respond to Jacob, who says that as far as he's concerned, their stories, as a genocide survivor, he happens to be a Hutu, his side of the story has never been told?
I think that, first of all, I think he has a point, because in fact, for example, up to now, we don't know actually if it is true that initially there was a saying that the plane that was carrying the two presidents, Major General Juvenal Habyarimana of Rwanda and Ntaryamira of Burundi, that when that plane crashed, it triggered what is called genocide. For 100 days, a lot of people were killed and what have you, largely on the basis of ethnicity, and sometimes on the basis of political affiliation and what have you. The thing is, let's face it, there is also other information that suggests that, on the contrary, that plane was shot, and was shot by certain forces and all that kind of stuff. So
on that note, we've run out of time. I look forward to hosting you another edition of Shaka Extra Time. Until then, thank you so much. I will see you next week. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.